Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulika al-Kareem. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Inshallah, we are going to talk about teaching science from a Qur'anic perspective. Science is a human activity, it's a civilizational activity. It's the enterprise of science emerges in a given civilization. And currently, we have a science that is globally accepted as the only tradition, the only way of exploring what science explores. So the first question we are going to discuss is how would we teach science from the Quranic perspective? But before we do that, the first question is, how would we even begin to ask that question? And like all other subjects that we are discussing in this series of converting Muslim schools to Islamic schools, we apply the same fundamental framework that Ibn Furak initially developed in the 4th century Hijri. And there is a context, there is a reason why this particular framework emerged to study every single branch of knowledge from one unified perspective. The framework that we are going to apply is the framework of the 10 fundamental foundational principles. We can apply this framework to every single branch of knowledge. And this is a unified framework that emerged in the Islamic civilization in the wake of arrival of tremendous amount of knowledge from the Greek civilization, to some extent also from the Hindu civilization, and later from the Roman civilization. So the translation movement that produced Arabic versions of the entirety of the Greek philosophy, the entirety of medical sciences, and to a large extent, almost everything that was available in Sanskrit. So all of these things were translated, all of these philosophies, ways of exploration, language, arts, history, everything was translated. That's a different story. Once translated, this material came into the Islamic civilization, and it benefited the emerging civilization in many ways, but at the same time, it produced an internal conflict, because the fundamental, we are talking about science, the fundamental concept of what we now call nature or the cosmos, the material from which the material world has been constructed, is a fundamental question. Science studies, natural science studies the cosmos and everything that is in it, everything that is material, that has matter, mada. Where did it come from? Where did the matter come from? Aristotle, everyone struggled with it, and Aristotle found a simple solution. He said matter is eternal. There was no movement when this cosmos came into existence, and there is no creator, of course. According to him, matter was eternal. So that solved the problem, and he constructed a huge system based on this fundamental concept that matter has always existed. Now, when this concept came to Islam, of course, we have the eternity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is only one eternal, but certainly we have two eternals, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and matter. Once we have matter, we can do everything. We can have the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and everything on the earth. But first we have to have matter. So it created a conflict. And it took almost 3 centuries of very diligent, wonderful effort to take what was acceptable from the Greek civilization and other civilizations as well, and discard what wasn't acceptable. And in the process, these 10 principles came into existence. We have another video about those 10 principles, but right now we are interested in applying those principles to teaching science from a Quranic perspective. The first principle, of course, is the al-had, the definition. What is science? What is science? And then we apply the other principles. But just to begin with the definition of science, I'm going to share the screen, and inshallah we look at the principles and then apply them to science. So indeed, إن مبادئ كل علم 10 الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة
ونسبة وفضل والواضع والاسم الاستمداد حكم الشارع مسائل والبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع حاز الشرفا.
Now, if we apply these fundamental principles, then we can perhaps convert these thousands and thousands of Muslim schools into Islamic schools. And al-had is the definition of a given subject, a given branch of knowledge. Al-ism is the name, and all the other 10 principles that we have. But inshallah, the first principle is enough for us to begin conversations about teaching science from the Quranic perspective. What is the definition of science? There are several definitions. There is no one single definition, but in general, science is the organized, systematic knowledge about the material world. This means that this activity has a history. This means there is history of science. This means that we understand that science appears within a civilization based on its own worldview. And modern science, as we know, appeared in the Western civilization, and it has now spread to every corner of the world. And there is no other scientific tradition in existence except for perhaps some medical science, which have become peripheral now. But there are still traditional practitioners of medical science. We'll talk about that later. Science has a history. Science also has a philosophy. Science also has politics involved in it. Science is hugely based on a system of economic support for the enterprise of science. Science also has sociology, meaning there are human beings who are called scientists. There is a community of scientists. Science has several other domains, and I'm going to just share the screen again about science and see what science does. So there is philosophy of science, sociology of science, politics of science, political economy of science, history of science, applied philosophy of science. And then we have, of course, history and philosophy of science in Islam. It's also important to realize that the contemporary enterprise of science, which arrived more or less entirely almost in the Western civilization, in the 17th century, is now almost 450 years old. And before that, there is a history of Islamic enterprise of science in Islamic civilization, which was about 800 years old. Something drastically changed in our concept of the cosmos through the efforts of people like Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, and all of these are non-Muslim names. The contemporary science that we are going to teach, if we are going to teach that science to Muslims, is thoroughly rooted in the Western civilization, and Western civilization is thoroughly rooted in the Greek civilization. As you know, our concept of the cosmos, which is the object of study of science, is through the Big Bang. Big Bang happened X number of billions of years ago. Then we have the start of the cosmos, and finally we have the Earth, and the same matter that emerged through Big Bang cooled off, and those molecules, inert molecules, somehow arrange themselves to become a living cell. And everything then is very easy to evolve. Once we have the cell, we can have the whole cosmos, the entire living cosmos, I mean. So from the inert, inorganic matter, which arose out of the Big Bang, we come to the cell, which has life. And once this simple cell is obtained through this scheme, we have every living thing coming out of that cell. So the cosmos that modern science studies, the object of science, needs to be first understood. When we teach science to Muslims, we are not just teaching structure of water molecule. We are teaching a philosophy of looking, a worldview of looking at the cosmos, looking at the material world, which is the subject or the object, depending on how we see it, of science. Are we comfortable with that? Then there is sociology of science, meaning there is a fraternity, there is a family, there is a group of human beings called scientists. And of course, we want to join that family of scientists, and we have constructed many pseudo-scientists in the contemporary world. I think if we are objective enough, we will realize that there is not a single Muslim scientist anywhere in the world. By that I mean they are workers in the vineyard of the Western civilization's enterprise of science. They are the immigrants, they are the laborers, they have been imported into the enterprise of science, and they put in whatever effort they put into that science. And some of it is beneficial, but they are not producing anything other than what everyone else is producing. Likewise, the science that happens in Medina or Mecca, there is nothing in Mecca, but close to Mecca, and in Medina, there are universities. So modern science is deeply and singularly anchored in the university system or research labs. So the structure of the enterprise of science also needs to be taught. And that structure also has an economy. Who funds scientific research? Why? Which projects are funded? Why? If we look at the statistical details of the enterprise of science, there are kinetic forces propelling the enterprise of science, and these are mostly in Europe and North America, and in North America, mostly America. It's the Department of Defense, and it's the pharmaceutical industry that is responsible for 95% of funding for scientific research. And both of these fundamental sectors of the enterprise of science have objectives, they have goals, they have specific reasons to fund what they fund. Therefore, when we teach science to our students, we need to also tell them what we are teaching. We are teaching a philosophy of looking at the cosmos. We are teaching enterprise of science being a civilizational activity. We are teaching that modern science is deeply anchored in the Western civilization, and just opening a university or a chemistry department in Medina does not make any difference whatsoever to the enterprise of science. All the instruments, all the fundamental, even the topics of research, everything comes from the heart of the Western civilization. We will, inshallah, look into that, but this is for the definition. Definition of science needs to be taught, because this is our first principle, al-had. What is it that we are teaching? We are teaching a branch of knowledge that studies the material world. The contemporary understanding of the material world is deeply rooted in a philosophy that is starkly against the Qur'anic worldview. Sometimes we feel very enthusiastic about the Big Bang and try to find it in the Quran, and there are perhaps hundreds of websites advertising and advocating, oh, we found the Big Bang in the Quran, and because it is in the Quran was revealed 1450 years before this thing happened, this idea came, therefore Quran must be the word of God. If we accept this concept, then we have to accept everything else that follows the Big Bang. Therefore, we will have no room for the mountains which would be doing tasbih with Dawud alayhi salam. We cannot have the ants recognizing the coming of the Junud, of the forces, of the soldiers of Sulaiman alayhi salam. We cannot have a bee that receives revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to construct these marvelous beehives about which Imam Ghazali wrote, the hexagonal structures and why they are hexagonal. We cannot have anything Quranic in the material cosmos. The fire would always burn because that is the property of fire, and it would not be cool for Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we need to understand, if we want to have the Big Bang, we cannot have the Quranic cosmos. The Quranic cosmos that came into existence fi sittati ayyam, in 6 days, everything in the samawat and the earth. 6 days. There is no problem in saying those 6 days were not literal 6 days. Our tradition has that explanation in the tafasirs. Timing is not the issue. Time factor is not the issue at all. Because unlike the Bible, the Quran does not have each day described as the Bible describes, and we don't need to worry about the time frame. Deep time is possible. That's not an issue. The issue is this cosmos, the subject of science or the object of science. I'm using both terms consciously because it can be subject, it can be object. Now, if we want to teach science from the Quranic perspective, we have to define science. Everything begins with definition. So inshallah, this is enough for the definition, which just opens windows for our children to understand that, number one, the modern contemporary enterprise of science is one enterprise of science in the human history. It's only about 450 years old if we stretch the time. Otherwise, it's perhaps less than that. There have been other enterprises of science, meaning systematic study of the material world, of the natural world. Before the rise of modern science, the longest scientific enterprise anywhere in the world was what appeared in the Islamic civilization. Before that, we had the Roman and the Greek civilization had its own science. The Chinese had their own tradition of science. But right now, there is no other tradition of science in the world. What does that mean for us Muslims? Does it mean that we accept everything that the modern science proclaims to have proven? Do we accept the fundamental secular aspect of the creation itself, the Big Bang? These are the questions dealing with the philosophy of science. And because our tradition is so rich in these discussions, it would be wonderful to have some of those discussions brought into, especially high school level, even middle school level, to what happened through the translation movement. When the same concept of the universe came into the Islamic tradition, what did we do? How did we process that knowledge which came into Islamic civilization from other civilizations? We can perhaps do the same. Although substantially the situation is very different from the situation that was there in the 8th and the 9th and the 10th century. At that time, the Islamic, the Muslim empire was expanding rapidly. It had tremendous amount of economic power, military power, social power. We don't have any of those. But there are ways to understand, perhaps start the process in a similar way, not identical, but similar way to what scholars like Ibn Fura, Imam Ghazali, and others did. So inshallah, the definition of science is the first part. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.